John Oliver of HBO, he's coming in for a lot of criticism lately because he is just awful all the way through. So John Oliver did a segment, and I think it's really fascinating to break down what the left does when they conflate a bunch of different myths altogether. So John Oliver is very upset with what he terms school segregation. Now, he doesn't mean formal school segregation, as in black people are not allowed to go to this school, only white people can go to this school. He's talking about informal segregation, and he talks about some of the problems with it without, of course, paying any attention to the real reason this is happening.
It would still be problematic, even if these schools were roughly equivalent academically, as that would still be a violation of the principle of Brown versus Board of Education that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. But in practice, they are very rarely equal in any way. Black and Latino children are more likely to attend schools with inexperienced teachers, which are then less likely to offer a college prep curriculum. On top of which, because race and class are inextricably linked, those students are 6 times as likely to be in high-poverty schools. And while there are teachers and students working incredibly hard in those places, they are often doing so with fewer resources. So how is it possible that our nation's schools are by some measures more segregated now than they have been in over 4 decades? Well, it turns out places like New York haven't so much resegregated as never really bothered integrating in the first place. Because the 1964 Civil Rights Act was very carefully crafted by Northern lawmakers. It targeted the kind of segregation by law which existed in the South, so you couldn't have a school that was officially designated whites only, but it exempted the so-called racial imbalance of Northern schools. So if a New York school was all white because it was drawing from an all-white area, even if that area had been kept that way due to a host of explicitly racist housing policies, that was somehow fine. And if you're thinking that is some hypocritical bullshit, you are not alone. Malcolm X was pointing this out in New York at the time.
Okay, so we can stop it there. So he goes on along these lines. So there are a couple of things he's conflating. First of all, he's conflating the idea of voluntary segregation with involuntary segregation. He does it right there. He says there's no difference. You know, the Civil Rights Act didn't force racial balance in schools that were racially imbalanced before. Right, because if there's nothing prohibiting a black person from joining the white school, and it's illegal to prohibit that black person from renting in that area, then what's the issue exactly? The real reason there's segregation in a lot of these schools, de facto segregation, not de jure, not in law, de facto segregation. The reason that there's de facto segregation in a lot of these schools is because, unfortunately, there's been a lot of white flight from inner cities, and the reason there's been a lot of white flight from inner cities is because of democratic tax policy, which has increased taxes on people to increase the services for the people who are impoverished in those areas, and people who are wealthier left those areas. Right, this is actually what happened in the aftermath of the 1964 Civil Rights Act in a lot of areas. And when they tried mandatory busing, people just moved out of the scope of mandatory busing. This is also true because union rules prevent desegregation by putting inexperienced teachers in crappy schools. The union negotiates on behalf of the more experienced teachers. The more experienced you get, the cushier the job is supposed to be. And there's no market incentive to teach in a really bad, downtrodden inner city school. Right? If you're a top teacher, what you really want is the top teachers at the crappy schools, presumably, and you want less experienced teachers at the better schools because the students are easier to deal with. You can learn how to deal with them there, and then you can go into a school that really needs more help, and you get paid a lot of money to do that. Michelle Reed tried to do this in Washington, D.C., and the teachers' union would have nothing to do with it. So instead what you get is the least qualified teachers teaching in the worst possible areas, and the most qualified teachers teaching in the really, really nice areas. Now, one of the arguments that Oliver and the left make is that the tax money that's paid in a lot of downtrodden areas is not equal to the amount that's paid in a lot of local areas that are more upper crust. That's true because richer areas tend to take in more tax revenue. But the money is not the solution because, for example, LAUSD spends about $10,000 per year per student, and that's not improving its educational metric at all. We've increased spending on education in the United States multiple times over. We spend a lot of money on education here in the United States, and it doesn't match up with the amount of accomplishment in education because education really comes down to a couple of factors. One, good teachers who are being paid properly for their services, and that means market rate for their services. And two, parents who care enough to ensure that their kids get a good education in spite of all the challenges that surround them. So this is not an excuse for bad public schools, but to suggest that it's white people being racist against black people and that's why predominantly black schools in the inner city are really crappy. No, it's government policy that drove people out of these cities. It's government policy that attempted to force people into associations they didn't want to be in, that drove people further and further out into the suburbs. That's why you saw white flight into the suburbs. The reality is that if you had a school voucher program where students of any race and any age could move into schools that were better, you'd immediately see a leveling effect. It's why school school vouchers are the single greatest civil rights issue of our time when it comes to black and Hispanic folks. The idea that you don't have a choice in the school you go to means you're trapped in a failing school by a union that wants your butt in the seat so they can all get paid. The best solution to desegregation here is to allow people to go where the best teachers are and where the best education is, and allow people to select that, because the market forces rule. The market forces do rule, and you will see that happen if the government allows market forces to rule. You don't see anything like desegregation among McDonald's. Why? Because there's a market for McDonald's in inner city communities. People are willing to pay for it, and so they get it. You actually don't see segregation in higher universities. Why? Because state schools are basically open admittance. Right now, they'll say that there's more segregation than ever in higher education too, because there aren't enough black and Hispanic people qualifying for the kind of minimum qualifications to get into these universities. But again, that's not a result of legal barriers. That's a result of all of these other informal barriers that we're talking about, including some of them are legal barriers, like not being able to go to the public school you want to go to, and part of them are informal barriers, like having a culture that doesn't value education in the same way that other cultures do. I mean, if you look at the difference between, and it's true even within, it's not even black and white issue. I mean, this is true even within different subsets of the Asian community. There are various cultures in the Asian community, some of which value education more than others. So this is not as easy a solution as John Oliver is basically suggesting here. Just get the government in to mandate that a certain number of black people go to a white school, a certain number of white people go to a black school. They tried this in the 1960s, and it ended up devastating virtually all of the schools. HBO's John Oliver belongs to a class of British people who think that they are smarter than everyone else by dint of their accent. They think that because they share an accent with Rex Harrison from My Fair Lady, this makes them geniuses. So John Oliver does a political show on American politics. He doesn't know much about American politics. He doesn't know much about politics generally, but he's been feted by the media because he's a comedian who's wildly to the left. So just like President Obama is going to be interviewed by Samantha Bee, who's legitimately the least funny person in human history, she and Trevor Noah actually have a cage match next week to determine who's the least funny person in human history. Both of them, I believe, beat Stalin for that title a while back. So now that we're going to unify the championships. So Obama's going to be on with Samantha Bee, where presumably they will jabber about how much they love each other and why abortion's wonderful. John Oliver was ripping on Donald Trump the other days at some awards ceremony, and because he's British, that means we're supposed to pay attention to him, even though we fought a revolution, so we wouldn't have to pay attention to the Brits. Here's John Oliver talking about abortion.
And in terms of the communication about reproductive rights and the conversation that is so important, we really did potentially hit a nadir in the modern era during that third debate, because his discussion of late-term abortions showed no real understanding of how abortions work, no clear understanding of the basic biology of women's bodies, and a very poor sense of grammar as well. So I guess we got, in a sense, what we were asking for. If you asked Donald Trump to draw a fallopian tube, I cannot imagine what you would get back other than a child's drawing of a cobra.
Okay, and I would hesitate to ask John Oliver to draw a fallopian tube or describe any of the biology here, because he obviously doesn't know. Now, look, I criticize Trump for being ignorant about how he described abortion because he wasn't graphic enough. But let me, for those who missed it, explain what exactly happens in a late-term abortion, which is what he was talking about, okay? What happens in a late-term abortion is something completely awful. This is according to AmericanPregnancy.org, okay? Not a right-wing pro-life website, AmericanPregnancy.org. Quote, "The fetus is rotated. Forceps are used to grasp and pull the legs, shoulders, and arms through the birth canal. A small incision is made at the base of the skull to allow a suction catheter inside. The catheter removes the cerebral material, that would be the brains, until the skull collapses. The fetus is then completely removed." Okay, that's one procedure that's used. That's dilation and extraction. Okay, in late-term abortions, it's usually one of these two, dilation and evacuation or dilation and extraction. Dilation and evacuation, the baby may be given a lethal injection to kill it. Sometimes they don't use such injections. Then the doctor uses a curette or a forceps to carve up the child's body in the womb and remove it piece by piece. So I guess that Donald Trump could have been more graphic. I don't know that John Oliver would have enjoyed that, but he could have been more graphic, I suppose. But this is what they do. They laugh it off. Oh, he can't draw a fallopian tube. Okay, John, draw an abortion. Really, draw it. Let's see it. I want to see you get down there with a piece of paper, and I want you to draw me what you think an abortion looks like. And it's not waving a magic wand, and it's not getting rid of a cluster of cells that mean nothing. I want you to sit there and draw what it looks like when a baby is cut into pieces and removed from the womb. I would like to see that. But of course, he'll never do that. Other than it might look like a cobra. It might look like a cobra. Maybe it'll look like a princess waving her fairy magic wand and a unicorn emerges from the vagina. The fact that he thinks his accent covers for his basic ignorance of biology and his euphemistic willingness to ignore what amounts to child killing is absolutely ridiculous and despicable.